So now that House of the Dragon is finally finished and we've had some time to really mull it over, let's talk about it. In this video, I'm going to talk about what part of the book and how much of it was used for this season, compare the book and the show, and review what I thought of each and why. Maybe we'll even get into some predictions for the next season. If you haven't already watched my first review video from before the show aired, you can check that out up here. And I also want to mention, as you may know, I'm not big on spoilers, but I am going to have to talk about what happens in the show and the corresponding parts of the book. And I'll keep as much of the non-essential other parts out of here as I can, but there will be some, and I do briefly talk about some of the history from the book before season 1's events. First of all, I want to start by talking about where in the book they pulled this history from. But first, I feel it's also important to mention that the chronology or order of events explained in the book versus the show aren't exactly even, and we'll talk about that also a little bit later on. The show starts off in the year 101 AC with King Jaehaerys choosing an heir and then quickly fast forwarding about 9 years. This happens, depending, I'm assuming on the edition you have, about page 380 in the book. Now personally, I was super disappointed immediately when I started watching the first episode because the part of the history of the Targaryens in Westeros that I was the most excited to see on the screen and have elaborated upon was Aegon's conquest. Them fleeing Valyria, him taking over the Seven Kingdoms, making the Iron Throne. So to have this skipped over was just brutal. And I am told that there is a short animated series that covers this, but I haven't seen it, and, you know, we don't want a short animated series. I don't understand the reason for jumping so far ahead when I thought the whole purpose of this series was to explore the history of this family and the events that led up to the Game of Thrones portion of the story. The tools are right there in the same book. Why not use it? It's not even like the beginning of this book is just further back in time. It's literally the beginning of the story. It also seems strange not to capitalize on that. Like, not only is that an enticing part of the story, but it's 100 years of exciting history that could have been made into 5 or even 10 seasons of the show leading up to where we are with this season. Granted, not all the history before this season's events are covered as in-depth in the book as these events, but because the book is styled as a history being told as opposed to the show which has a narrative telling, it leaves so much room for adaptation, which I will add had to be done for this anyways. And they made some really good changes in the show compared to the book, which we'll talk about a bit later on. From the end of Aegon's conquest to the ascension of King Viserys, there is a full mess of exciting conflict, war, political intrigue. Why not cover the conflict of Prince Rhaena Targaryen, the first rider of Dreamfire, who was set to inherit the throne from her fathers, Aenys the First, but instead Jaehaerys took the crown. I mean, I don't want to spoil too much of what happened there, but I suppose there is always the possibility for those parts of the story to come later. I just think it's strange to not go chronologically, since this series has already gone back in time from the original series. I suppose another reason for them choosing this particular part of the book to adapt for the first season could have to do with this being the apex of Targaryen power. At this point in time, it's said that more lords and princes were claiming the blood of the dragon than ever before, and there were at this point also more dragons living than ever before, except maybe back in Valyria. But if that's the case, I still don't see why they would skip over the entire build up to it. Imagine being able to watch the Targaryens build up their power and kingdom in this new part of the world, then finally after years and years, this season comes out when we can finally see the true full power of their destiny. Like I said, without giving way more than I need to, there is just so much that happens leading up to King Viserys becoming king that I would have loved to see played out on the screen over the course of multiple seasons to really get a sense of the entirety of the Targaryen identity in Westeros. And I also feel like that would have given us as viewers almost like the ancestral memory to draw upon when considering the original series and really thinking about Daenerys and Jon Snow's destinies. A few other small notes on these parts being skipped are that we miss all the history of the other houses of Westeros. As I said in the first video on this, one of the most interesting things I found in the first portion of the book I read, apart from the Targaryens themselves, was learning about other well-known house histories in Westeros, alongside with learning how some of them got their power, when they became powerful, who their allies and friends and enemies were 300 years before we see them in Game of Thrones. We also miss out on being introduced to some of the houses and families that had power and lost it or died out. This is all important history to bring context to deepen our understanding of the conflicts and events that unravel in Westeros. And having said that, I would not hesitate to read the book up to a point, which I'll mention when we get there. This does bring me to my next point of interest with this adaptation: watching the show first and reading the book second. This is what I ended up doing for this season, but not by design, just by chance. I didn't know what part of the book would be covered in the show, and had decided that maybe because of its historiography style, delivery, it would be cool to read alongside the show, but I never ended up doing that, and it wouldn't have worked out well anyways because the show starts off so far into the book. But I did get a comment on my first video from Jade Cabantac that said, "It dawned on me that I should watch it before I read the books." And I thought this was a bit weird. I had never heard anyone advocating for watching first, reading second, but I think for this series, and really any George R. R. Martin book, it actually is helpful to watch it first because there are so many characters and names introduced so fast that I find it difficult to keep organized. And this way, I felt when I was reading it that I knew who everyone was and had a much easier time focusing on the events and who was doing what, because I had those solid visuals already in my mind to link with those names. This book is also not really narrative driven, so it's even more difficult to keep track of who everyone is because they may only be mentioned a handful of times. So definitely watching the show first for this series is something that I'm definitely behind. You can always do both if you have the time and interest. The show's writers did a great job extrapolating the details for characters, conflicts, timelines, and relationships from the book. Many of the descriptive passages are somewhat out of order in the book, and some of the character descriptions are very short. Sure, Christian Cole is a great example. He isn't really referenced too much in the book, but after reading over his introduction post-show, the way they pulled his character out of the pages and onto the screen feels very genuine, and I can really see the truth in his character from one medium to the next. Another good example of this is when Daemon kills the crab feeder. In the book, this particular event is explained in literally no detail. It's one sentence. However, with the bits and pieces the writers took from his character descriptions and the large events, I think the way they flushed it out was extremely well done. They were able to take basically a nothing moment in the book and turn it into one of the best parts of the show. And they did this without sacrificing the authenticity of the character, the events, or the lore. It didn't feel to me, at least, like an overthought, grab the viewers at all costs scene, which you can usually expect for something like this. When comparing Fire and Blood to House of the Dragon, there's one curiosity that really sticks in my mind. Is the show meant to be an actuality of events or just the common assumption of what happened? What I mean by this is that where the story or history is concerned in the book, as I said in my last video on the subject, the author admits that some things are unknown. Much of the recounting of events comes from several conflicting sources. The testimony of Mushroom, a verbal account of a court fool penned by some unknown scribe, which tends to be rather foul and raunchy, and the accounts of Septim Eustace being the most prominent for this time period. The example I have for this is when Daemon returns from slaying the crab feeder and gives Viserys his crown, we have, in this case, a statement of considered fact that Daemon stayed in King's Landing for 6 months and then left. This much is known, as the book's author says. As to what happened after, we must look to more dubious chronologers, obviously implying that some part of the story, in fact, are common knowledge, whereas the rest is based on hearsay and the recordings of untrustworthy sources. Essentially meaning that we can't know for sure what happened. This is followed shortly by the author stating that this is where our sources diverge, where multiple accounts of the relationship between Daemon and Rhaenyra and the reason for his leaving are given. Only one of these accounts includes them acting intimately together and visiting brothels. So, is the show meant to be a way of clarifying these unknowns for the reader or viewer, or is it meant to be more of a dramatization of what the author or teller of the story in the books assumes to be what took place? And if so, who are they and what are their biases? Intertwined with the story that we see on screen are many mentions of Harrenhal in the book, and if you watched the last video, you know that history of Harrenhal is something I find fascinating, and I just want to see what happens there and leads to its chaotic state in the original series. So here are some of the minor details that were changed from the book for the on-screen adaptation that I noticed and personally think made the immersion and emotional depth of the show better. When Aemon claims Vhagar and Lucerys takes his eye with the dagger, in the book, it is the three sons of Princess Rhaenyra and Aemon who are present during this conflict, but in the show, Daemon's daughters are there. This slight change makes the scene much more intense and emotionally charged because the dragon Aemon is trying to claim belonged to their mother, who has literally just passed away, and because Rhaena was still without a dragon and was going to claim Vhagar for herself, which makes sense since it was her mother's. It also states in the book that it was Rhaenyra who sends Daemon to take the head of Varmund Valerian when he makes the claim that her children are bastards born of Harwin Strong and therefore shouldn't inherit Driftmark. This is a fairly sizable contrast to the show where Daemon witnesses the claim and acts in the moment, and in the book, Varmund is Lord Corlys' nephew, which is changed to his brother in the show. These changes, again, made the scene way more engaging and intense, and I think it fits more authentically with the portrayal of Daemon's character. Another notable difference between the show and the book comes in parts that culminate to one of the best yet quite frustrating scenes in the first season. The reasoning behind the frustration element of that scene becomes clear once you read the book, but more on that in a second. This set of differences starts off fairly general. being that in the book, the depth of knowledge and intimacy with the history of the Valyrian family becomes intertwined throughout the book, leading up to the section, but between the pages of the book where this season takes place, there is very little to draw you into them as key players and characters or persons of interest. We obviously know who they are, but as I think it's optimal to be able to read the corresponding sections of the book with the show, it makes it frustrating that to get the depth, understanding, and history, you would need to read other parts of the book and possibly spoil future seasons of the show. The main, in my opinion, reason this was changed for the better, or at least had more integration with the greater history contained in the book, is because of Princess Rhaenys, who, by the way, has a great storyline earlier on and is definitely worth reading, hopefully alongside an on-screen adaptation for one of the seasons. But without spoiling too much of her pre-season 1 story, the way her character was integrated into the show was wonderful because it really reflects who she is as a character, despite being literally barely mentioned more than a handful of times, like almost as an afterthought. When Aegon is crowned and she bursts through the door in her dragon and doesn't burn them all alive, this is the super frustrating scene, because like it would have been so easy to just kill them all and allow Rhaenyra to take the throne and basically be incredibly indebted to you. But once you read the book, you realize why she doesn't kill them, although that didn't make much sense. And it's because in the book, she wasn't even at Dragonstone. There were no hiccups in the crowning of Aegon II, and this scene was altered for 2 reasons. One, because in the book, he's crowned and just kind of flies around the city on his dragon, super anticlimactic. And 2, to really develop the importance of the Valyrian relationship with Rhaenyra, the Rhaenyran camp for the crown, and to really showcase what the fucking badass Rhaenys is. And I think to really add to the buildup of what to expect next season, to be honest. On that note, my prediction for next season, without having read any further than Lucerys and Aemond, is that this buildup is leading to an epic war for the 2nd season. We're currently in the time when the most dragons since Old Valyria exist, and we know they all die out within a couple hundred years. So that to me is easy math. Huge dragon war. I also have to base this prediction on another thing. The season finale, don't get me wrong, had a huge upsetting scene, ending on a real cliffhanger, driving us all to want more. But overall, I was honestly a bit disappointed with the entire episode because of the overall lack of intensity. Leave out that one scene, and I wasn't on the edge of my seat once. So they must be either saving it all up for next season and its premiere, or they're going to shit the bed, but I'm putting my money on the first option. Before I go, I do have one warning for readers. Around page 430 in my edition is where I became a bit wary of continuing on. Lucerys hadn't been killed yet, but some other information comes forth that I can only assume holds a few hints at spoilers for the next season, or at least the first episode. So this is where I stopped reading for now. I haven't decided quite yet if I want to wait for the show, but I'm leaning that way. And this concludes my comparison review of House of the Dragon and Fire of Blood for Season 1. I hope you found that interesting and insightful. If you disagree with me on anything, leave me a comment and let's talk it out. If you liked this video, give me a like and hit that subscribe button. There's always more fun content coming up eventually. So thanks, and I'll check you later.